He handed the company keys to his mistress in front of 300 guests. Then he looked at his wife and smiled. "You were just cheap labor." The room waited for her to break. She didn't. She just nodded, slow, certain, like a reporter confirming a quote, because that's exactly what she was doing. Most people in that ballroom believed they were watching a woman lose everything. They were wrong. The woman standing quietly in the green dress had known for weeks exactly how this night would end. While everyone else saw a humiliated wife, Adès saw something very different. A man walking confidently toward a fall he could no longer avoid. And the louder the applause around him became, the less he realized that the story of his triumph had already been written, and he was standing in its final chapter. Her name was Adès Whitfield, and the people in that glittering room knew her only as the wife, just the wife. The woman who stood a careful half-step behind Terence at every ribbon cutting, who refilled the coffee at the investor breakfasts, who remembered the names of everyone's children and asked about their mother's surgeries. They did not know that she had drawn the very first floor plan of Whitfield Logistics on the back of a grease-stained diner napkin, arguing routes and margins while the eggs went cold. They did not know whose mind had built the thing they had all gathered to celebrate with champagne. That night she wore a deep green dress, the color of something that grows back, and in her small beaded clutch sat a single fountain pen, silver, engraved, worn smooth at the grip. It was the only thing she had carried with her, unbroken, from the very beginning. The pen had been his gift years ago, back when his hands still trembled with gratitude instead of greed. He had pressed it into her palm the afternoon they signed their first real contract, a small and terrifying thing, a single warehouse lease that could have ruined them. "For the woman who makes it real," he had said then, looking at her like she was the only solid thing in the world. And he had meant it. In those days, he had meant every word. She had used that pen to sign every contract that mattered after. The vendor agreements, the lease renewals, the emergency loan that saved them in the brutal second winter when the trucks sat frozen and the accounts ran dry. That pen had touched more of the company's living bones than Terence's hands ever had. She kept it close, the way some people keep a wedding ring, except that hers had never once stopped meaning what it meant. To understand how a woman ends up nodding calmly while her husband hands her entire life to another woman, you have to go back. Back past the rooftop and the keys, back past the fleet and the contracts, to a cramped apartment above a laundromat where the radiator clanked all night like a trapped ghost, and the rent was always 3 days late. That was where it started, with 2 people and one stubborn idea and almost nothing else between them and the street. Adès had been a business journalist then, and a good one, with a byline that readers trusted and an editor who fought the higher floors to keep her. She gave it all up. She folded her own hard-won career into his dream as though it were the most natural trade in the world, because in those days she truly believed they were building one shared life together, and not, as it turned out, 2 very separate ones. She was the one who understood the numbers, who could read a spreadsheet the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Terence had the smile, the easy handshake, the gift of making an entire room lean toward him, like plants toward a window. But Adès had the mind that knew how freight truly moved across a map, how margins thinned to nothing in the wrong contract, how a single buried clause could quietly strangle a young company in its sleep. She negotiated their first real hauling deal at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the baby monitor crackling softly in the corner, while Terence slept the deep sleep of a man who trusted someone else to stay awake. By dawn, she had saved them $11,000 and cut out a clause that would have sunk them inside a year. She never even told him about the clause. She simply fixed it and let him carry the good news to the client like it was his own. For a long stretch of years, that quiet arrangement felt exactly like love. He stood in the light, and she held up the structure behind him. And the company grew the way a tree grows, slowly, and then all at once, until one day you look up, and it is taller than the house. The single warehouse became three. The three became a fleet. The fleet became contracts with names that everyone in the city recognized. And somewhere in all that growing, something inside Terence began to change. So gradually and so quietly that even she, who noticed everything, very nearly missed it. He began saying, "I built," where he used to say, "we built." He began introducing her as "my wife," the way a man mentions the weather, a fact of no particular interest. The shift was small, almost nothing, a few words here and there. But Adaze had spent an entire lifetime learning to read the smallest of things. The first real crack arrived wearing a name: Simone. She came in as a consultant, hired to modernize the brand, and Terence announced it like it was nothing at all, the way men so often announce the very things that will one day undo them. Simone was sharp and polished, and laughed at his jokes a half-second too long, and held his gaze a half-second past what was decent. Adaze watched the way her husband's whole posture changed when Simone entered a room, the way he stood a little taller, pulled in his stomach, found reasons to touch the small of the woman's back during an office tour, and then jerked his hand away when he remembered, too late, that his wife had eyes. Adaze said nothing about any of it. She poured the coffee. She remembered the clients' children's names, and she watched. Then came the money, and money never lies the way people do. A reporter never fully stops being a reporter, and Adaze still read every financial statement the way she had once read a nervous source across a table, looking for the small lie hiding underneath the smooth and practiced surface. She found the little things first, the way you always do. A consulting fee far larger than any consulting could explain. A new account she had never opened and did not recognize. Transfers timed to land on quiet weekends when the office was empty and no one was watching the ledgers. None of it screamed. All of it whispered. And out of pure old habit, the same instinct that had once made her a journalist worth keeping, she began to make copies. Quiet copies, saved where no one would think to look. She told herself she was only being careful. She did not yet allow herself to say, even silently, the other word for what she was doing. She remembered one particular evening, near the very end of that slow unraveling, with a clarity that would never leave her. Terence came home late, smelling of someone else's perfume and a restaurant they had never once visited together. He kissed her forehead the way you kiss an aunt, called her babe without looking up, and asked, mildly, what there was for dinner. And Adaze, standing at the stove with the wooden spoon still in her hand and the steam rising into her face, felt the precise moment the marriage finished dying inside her chest. It did not explode. There were no thrown plates, no slammed doors. It simply went quiet and still, like a great machine that someone, somewhere, had finally reached over and switched off. She stirred the pot. She served the food. And she decided, standing right there in the warm kitchen, that she would not be the one screaming in this story. She would be the one who knew. That was the thing the whole room would never understand about the calm woman in the green dress. By the time you saw her standing so composed at that gala, the screaming was already long over. She had done all of it alone, in the dark, into a pillow pressed hard against her own mouth, in the gray, small hours of a dozen sleepless nights, weeks before. She had grieved the marriage like a death, because it was won, and what was left of her after all that grief had finally burned itself down to ash was not weakness, and it was not numbness. It was clarity, pure and cold and steady. And clarity, living quietly inside a woman that everyone in her life has spent years underestimating, is the single most dangerous thing in any room she chooses to walk into. The night she found the truth itself, she had not even been looking for it. That is how the worst discoveries always seem to come, sideways, when your guard is down. She had gone into the home office near midnight only to find a misplaced invoice, nothing more, and the desktop computer had been left awake and unlocked. Terence grown careless the way confident men always grow careless right before the fall. A folder sat open on the screen. Inside that folder waited a single document, an ownership transfer, drafted and very nearly signed, quietly moving the controlling interest in Whitfield Logistics out of the company she had bled to build and into a brand new holding entity. The company, all of it, would belong to Simone. And Adaise's own name had been carefully, surgically, deliberately removed from every single page, as though she had never existed at all. She sat down slowly in the leather office chair that she herself had paid for with her own work. She read the document once, and then a second time, and then a third, making absolutely certain. Her face did not change at all, not a flicker, not a tremor, but her hand drifted of its own accord into her cardigan pocket and found the fountain pen there, the way a person standing at a great height reaches blindly for a railing, and she gripped it so tightly that the engraving pressed thin white lines into the soft of her palm. The pen that had signed the entire company into existence was now the only thing in that dim room that still remembered what she was truly owed. She did not cry. The crying had all happened weeks before in the dark. What rose in her chest instead was something colder, quieter, and infinitely more useful than tears. And then she saw the second name on the document, and the floor dropped out from beneath her a second time in a different and far deeper way. The lawyer who had structured the entire transfer, who had built the careful legal walls designed to keep her out forever, was not a stranger at all. It was Desmond, her own sister's husband, the man who had carved the Thanksgiving turkey at her table every single year for 9 years running, who had toasted her at her wedding, who had bounced her nieces on his knee. The same man who, only a few months earlier, had sat across from her with a warm and sympathetic face and offered, so kindly, to review your financial protections, Ada, just to keep you safe. He had not been protecting her at all. He had been quietly measuring her for the cut. The betrayal of the husband was a deep wound, but the betrayal of family was a knife, and she had handed it to him herself, hilt first. A lesser woman in a lesser story would have stormed up those stairs that very night, thrown the laptop against the wall, screamed his name until the neighbors 3 doors down heard every word. But Adaise did none of that. She closed the folder exactly as she had found it, down to the angle of the open window on the screen. She slid the office chair back to its precise position against the desk. She switched off the lamp. And standing alone in the deep dark of the office she had furnished with the fruit of her own labor, she took out her phone and made a single, quiet call. She kept her voice very low and very even. "It's me," she said into the receiver. "I think it's time." Then she ended the call, climbed the stairs, lay down in the bed beside the man who was stealing her entire life, and slept more deeply than she had in months. Who had she called, there in the dark? That single question would sit unanswered for a long, long time. The very next morning, the strategy began, though no living soul watching her would ever have called it that. To all the world, a days simply seemed lighter somehow, easier in her own skin. She smiled more freely. She stopped picking at the late nights and the missed dinners. And Terence, flooded with relief, mistook her newfound peace for ignorance, for surrender, never once imagining it might be something else entirely. Because a careless man who becomes convinced that he has finally gotten away with something only grows more careless still. He stopped bothering to hide the perfume. He took longer and longer lunches without explanation. He began speaking openly about the future of the company, with a bright gleam in his eye that no longer made any room for her at all. And every careless thing he did, every slip and every boast, she quietly noted down and filed away. Because here is precisely what Terence had forgotten, what Simone had never once bothered to learn, and what Desmond had been far too greedy to stop and consider. Before Adaze was the silent wife, before she was the invisible architect of an entire empire, she had been a journalist, a genuinely good one, the kind editors lose sleep over losing. And she still knew, in her bones, how to build a story that would hold up under any weight thrown against it. She knew the wide difference between idle gossip and hard evidence, between a wild accusation thrown in anger and a single, documented fact that no lawyer alive could ever shake loose. And somewhere out there in this same city was an old editor who still remembered her name, who still owed her the simple debt of a good story, told true and told well. She met him in a quiet coffee shop on the east side of the city, a graying man named Gerald, who had been her editor in the old days, who had wept openly at her wedding and warned her gently, even then, that she was giving up far too much of herself for one man's dream. When she laid it all out before him, he did not once say, "I told you so." He simply listened, document by document, transfer by transfer, signature by signature, his coffee going stone cold in the cup between his folded hands. When at last she finished and the silence settled, he was quiet for a long, weighing moment. Then he asked her the only question that truly mattered in the end. "Ada," he said, "can you prove all of it?" And Daisy, for the very first time in all those long, bruised months, smiled a real and unguarded smile. "Every word," she told him softly. "I kept copies of everything. I always keep copies. You taught me that." What she was patiently building was not a tantrum, and it was not revenge. It was a case. Financial records arranged in careful, damning order. The transfer documents with Desmond's signature sitting plainly beside Terence's, the two of them bound together on the page. Bank statements that traced the inflated consulting fees all the way to their true and hidden destination. A clean, undeniable timeline of a man methodically dismantling his own wife's life work and the family lawyer who had drawn up the blueprints to help him do it. She was not going to stand and scream the truth at anyone. She was going to publish it, fully sourced and verified and impossible for any of them to deny. And there remained just one final piece that she still needed, the cruelest and the most necessary piece of the entire puzzle. She needed Terence to say it out loud, with his own mouth, in front of the people who mattered most to him. Somewhere, it could never be taken back. So when the invitation to the grand launch gala first began to take shape on the planning table, Adaise did a small thing that would have frozen the blood in Terrence's veins, had he possessed the wit to understand it. She quietly made certain that the press would be there. She arranged the media credentials herself, discreetly, routing them through Gerald's outlet under an unremarkable name. The official photographers list, the pre-approved members of the media, the unassuming young man who would stand near the bar with a phone, recording what everyone would assume was harmless promotional footage. And Terrence approved every bit of it without ever once reading the names on the list, because reading the tedious details had always been her job, never his. And not in his wildest imaginings had he ever pictured that the very woman handling all his paperwork might one day be quietly handling his undoing. The trap was not slammed shut on him. It was held gently, patiently open, and he came strolling into it, smiling, dressed in his finest, certain he was the host of his own triumph. In those final, tightening weeks before the gala, the very air around Adaise seemed to change, and the sharper, older people in Terrence's orbit felt the shift long before any of them could name it. A board member named Curtis, an old and shrewd man who had put his money into the very first warehouse on nothing more than a handshake and a feeling, drew her quietly aside at a planning dinner one evening. He asked her a pointed question about an old freight contract, a question that only the company's true owner could possibly have answered. And Adaise answered it perfectly, completely, without a moment's hesitation, the numbers falling from her like water. The way old Curtis looked at her afterward, slow and reassessing over the rim of his glass, was the very first visible sign that the real story, the one running underneath the official one, had begun to rise toward the surface. He said nothing at all, but from that night forward, he began watching Terrence very differently. Simone felt the change too, in the way that predators always sense a shift in the wind before the storm arrives. She had grown bold and comfortable in her victory, draping herself over the arm of a man she fully believed she had already won and pocketed. But Adaise's unbroken calm unsettled her in a way she could not name or explain away. At a rehearsal for the gala, Simone made a deliberate point of laughing too loudly and too brightly right beside Adaise, testing her, probing for the small flinch of pain that would confirm her total triumph. Adaise only turned slowly and looked at her, steady and entirely unbothered, the way one might glance at bad weather through a thick pane of glass from inside a warm room. And Simone, for the very first time, felt the cold finger of real doubt slide its way down the length of her spine. She covered it quickly with another laugh, louder than the first. But she had felt it, and it did not leave her. Terrence felt it last of all, because men like Terrence always feel it last, when it is far too late to matter. He noticed his wife sleeping soundly beside him through the night, untroubled. He noticed her humming softly to herself in the kitchen over breakfast. He noticed old Curtis watching him a beat too long at the board meetings, and a longtime vendor who suddenly and inexplicably wanted absolutely everything put down in writing, and even his own lawyer, who called him one afternoon to ask, carefully and twice, whether the ownership transfer had been fully and properly papered. Something was wrong. He could feel the polished floor beginning to tilt beneath his expensive shoes, but every single time he turned to look for the source of his unease, all he ever found was his quiet, smiling wife, handing him his morning coffee, asking him sweetly what he planned to wear to the launch. So he decided in the end that he was simply imagining things, jumping at shadows. That one small decision would go on to cost him absolutely everything he had. The gala was held high on a rooftop in the heart of downtown, all glass and brushed steel, and the whole glittering city spread out far below like something that could simply be bought and owned. 300 guests in their very finest clothes, investors and journalists, the full board, the extended family, the people who had watched the company rise. Adais had chosen the deep green dress entirely on purpose, and no one but her knew why. It was the exact color she had worn the long-ago night they signed that first terrifying warehouse lease, the night the silver pen first found its way into her open hand. She moved through the perfumed crowd like a woman walking calmly through her own quiet funeral, greeting people warmly, remembering each name, asking after each family, the fountain pen resting cool and patient inside the clutch against her hip. And over near the bar, a young man she had never once been introduced to lifted his phone, angled it just so, and began, very casually, to record. The lights dimmed and gathered toward the stage. Terence stepped up into them to a wave of applause he had done nothing to earn, and he basked in the warmth of it the way he always had, arms spread wide, smile blazing white. He thanked the investors for their faith. He thanked the board for their wisdom. He thanked, with a hand laid flat and reverent against his own chest, the vision that built all of this, from nothing. He did not, anywhere in his long and glowing speech, think to thank his wife. Not once. And then, with the cameras rolling steadily and the champagne running high and warm through 300 bloodstreams, he went and did the thing that men only ever do when they are utterly, fatally certain that they have already won the whole game. He decided, for no reason but the pleasure of it, to be cruel for sport. He smiled out at the crowd, and he called Simone up onto the stage to join him. She rose from her seat in a red dress that had been designed stitch by stitch to be seen and remembered, and a low murmur of uncertainty rolled through the crowd. Terence lifted a set of ceremonial keys from a small velvet box, the gleaming, symbolic keys to the brand-new headquarters, and he held them up high so they caught and threw the light. "Behind every great company," he announced to the room, "there is the one person who really runs it, the one with the true vision, the future of all of this." And with that, slowly, savoring it, he placed the keys into Simone's open and waiting palm and gently closed her manicured fingers around them. Simone turned then, holding the keys against her heart, and let her gaze travel out across the silent crowd until it found and settled on Adaise's face. And then she smiled. It was not a kind smile, or a nervous one. It was the wide, slow, satisfied smile of a woman who fully believed she had just taken everything in the world that mattered and gotten clean away with all of it. Then Terence turned deliberately to face his wife, who stood near the very front of the crowd in her deep green dress, perfectly and completely still. Perhaps some last black impulse of cruelty needed an audience to feel real. Perhaps, drunk on the moment, he simply could not stop himself. He looked down at the woman who had drawn the first floor plan on the back of a diner napkin, who had saved them $11,000 at a kitchen table at 2 a.m. while he slept, who had quietly given up her own good name and her own bright career to carry his name forward into the world. And into the live microphone, with the cameras rolling and 300 people holding their breath, he said the 7 words that would end him completely. "Don't look so wounded, sweetheart," he said, smiling. "You were just cheap labor." The entire crowd inhaled sharply as one single body. Somewhere off to the side, a champagne glass clinked too hard against a marble tabletop. 300 faces turned at once toward Aday's, every one of them braced for the inevitable collapse, the tears, the public shattering of a humiliated and discarded wife. It was, after all, exactly what 1,000 stories had trained every person in that room to expect from a moment like this one. And in that frozen, terrible, suspended instant, Adayes did the one single thing that not one soul in the entire room was prepared for. She did not crumble. She did not weep. Instead, she reached calmly into her small beaded clutch, drew out the silver fountain pen, and held it up for one long moment in the light, turning it just enough that its worn engraving could be seen by those near the front. And then she nodded, slow and certain and entirely composed, exactly like a reporter confirming a quote. Because that, precisely, was what she was doing. "Thank you, Terence," she said. Her voice was not loud at all, but the room had fallen so completely and so suddenly silent that her words carried clean to every far corner of it. "I needed you to say it out loud, on the record." She turned then, not toward him, but toward the young man standing near the bar, who slowly lowered his phone and gave her a single, deliberate nod across the crowd. And then Adayes lifted her own face to the 300 guests, and the press credential that had hung, clipped and unnoticed inside her clutch all evening, now rested plainly visible in her raised hand. "For those of you here tonight who don't actually know me," she said, her voice steady as stone, "my name is Adayes Whitfield, and before I was ever his wife, I was a journalist. So tonight you should know, I am here in both capacities at once." The single call she had made that midnight, alone in the dark of the home office, finally answered itself at last, there on that glittering rooftop, in front of every person who mattered. The young man with the phone was Gerald's reporter, placed and waiting. The story was already written, every line of it. The records, the timed transfers, Desmond's damning signature sitting beside Terrence's own, the consulting fees that had never once been for any consulting, the slow and systematic theft of an entire company from the very woman who had built it from a napkin sketch. All of it verified twice over, all of it sourced, all of it sitting ready and scheduled to go live across the world the very instant she gave the single word. "The keys you just so generously handed out," Adayes said, gently, almost kindly, into the ringing silence, "belong to a company that was transferred through fraudulent paperwork. I have every single document. So does my editor. And so, in about 10 minutes, will everyone in this city with a phone." She walked, unhurried, to a small cocktail table near the stage, set down upon it a single clean sheet of paper, and signed her name across the bottom of it with the engraved silver pen, the very same pen that had signed the entire company into existence all those long years before. It was the release authorizing publication. The pen that had built Whitfield Logistics, stroke by careful stroke, now ended in a single signature, the towering lie that had been built on top of it. The faint scratch of the nib against the paper was, for one held breath, the only sound in the entire vast room. And when she straightened up and turned, she looked directly at Terence, and for the first time in all that long night, she let him see, plainly, that she had known. All of it. For weeks. His face slowly drained to the exact gray color of cold ash, and the gleaming keys, still clutched in Simone's frozen hand, had become, in the space of 2 short minutes, nothing more than a fistful of worthless metal. All across the wide room, phones began to light up, one after another. A board member's screen glowed blue in the dimness, then another beside it. Then a dozen more, then 100. The breaking story spreading through the stunned crowd in real time as Gerald's outlet pushed it live into the world. People read, heads bowed. People looked up slowly at Terence frozen on his stage. People looked back down and read the words a second time, to be sure. Curtis, the old investor, rose heavily and deliberately from his seat, and the look carved into his weathered face was not shock at all, but the grim and final confirmation of something he had already begun, quietly, to suspect for weeks. And over on the stage, Simone's manicured hand simply opened, all on its own. The ceremonial keys slid from between her fingers and struck the polished floor with a bright, ringing clatter that every single person in that silent room heard. No one moved to pick them up. No one ever would. What followed in the next minutes was not a fight, because Terence had nothing whatsoever left to fight with. The truth was simply in the room now, fully grown and breathing and undeniable, multiplying itself silently across 300 glowing screens. He opened his mouth to speak and found that no words at all would come out of it. The easy charm that had carried him smoothly through his entire life had finally run headlong into a wall that it could not talk its way through or around. He looked down at the fallen keys glinting on the floor. He looked at the woman in the red dress, who was already, instinctively, stepping a careful distance away from him. He looked out at the crowd of 300 faces that would no longer rise to meet his eyes. And then, at the very last, he looked at his wife, the cheap labor, standing calm and unbroken in her deep green dress with the silver pen still resting in her steady hand, and he understood, fully and far too late, exactly who it was that had been quietly running everything all along, from the very first day. The weeks that followed the rooftop unfolded like a slow and patient avalanche, and Adaiz never once had to push a single stone of it downhill. The story itself did all the work. By the next morning, it had been picked up everywhere, in every outlet, the headline clean and surgical and utterly devastating, the supporting documents impossible for anyone to dispute or explain away. The board convened an emergency session and voted to freeze the transfer before noon. The very fraudulent paperwork that had been so carefully drawn up to lock Adaiz out of her own company forever now became, instead, the rope that bound Terence's hands behind him, because fraud, once it is proven in the light, unwinds and unravels every single thing it has ever touched. Investors who had been all warm smiles and firm handshakes at the gala now returned his frantic calls only with their lawyers listening silently on the line. Old Curtis personally led the motion to remove him from the company that bore his name. It passed unanimously before lunch. Simone was the very first to disappear, the way the bold and grasping ones always do the precise moment the money stops being a sure and certain thing. She had attached herself, limpet-like, to a man purely for what he had and what he could give her. And so the instant he had nothing left at all, there was simply nothing remaining for her to attach herself to. The red dress and the too loud laugh moved on, quickly and without a backward glance, to other rooms and other wealthier arms. The keys she had held so triumphantly for 2 glorious minutes turned out, in the end, to open precisely nothing. And Desmond, the family lawyer, the brother-in-law, the man who had carved the Thanksgiving turkey at her own table for 9 long years, found his own name printed plainly in the published documents, his signature sitting there beside Terrence's like a written confession in his own hand. Daisy's sister quietly stopped setting a place for him at the family table. The family drew itself closed around the wound, the way a body does, and left him standing alone on the outside of it. Adais never once raised her voice through any single part of it. She gave no triumphant television interviews. She posted not one word about any of it on any screen. When the reporters called her phone, hungry for a quote, she let the documents do all the speaking on her behalf, because she had always known, deep in her bones, that a single fact stated plainly and quietly is far louder in the end than any scream could ever hope to be. Terrence lost the company first. Then he lost the large house that the company's money had paid for. Then, last of all, he lost the wide circle of friends who, it turned out, had only ever been admirers of his success and never of the man himself. He called her just once, very late on a cold night, his voice cracked and small and stripped of all its old charm, to ask her brokenly how she could ever have done this thing to him. She listened, for a long, quiet moment, to the voice of the man she had once loved with her whole heart. And then she said, simply, and without any heat at all, "I didn't do anything to you, Terrence. I just finally stopped covering for you." And she hung up the phone. She did not call him back, that night or ever. The months passed, the way that months always do, slowly softening the sharpest and most jagged edges of everything they touch. And then, on one bright and ordinary morning in the early days of spring, on a quiet, tree-lined street, a woman in a soft green cardigan slid a key into the lock and opened the door of a small storefront that belonged, every brick and every board of it, entirely and only to her. The freshly painted sign hanging above the wide front window read, simply and cleanly, Whitfield Consulting, the name taken back and made wholly her own again. Inside there were no cameras waiting, no jostling crowds, no smiling man standing in the best of the light to take the credit for the quiet work of her hands. There was only a clean and uncluttered desk set beside a tall window, a fresh pot of coffee that she had brewed that morning entirely for herself, and the early spring sun laying long bars of soft gold across the wooden floor. Her very first client arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, a nervous young woman just beginning a small business of her own, clutching a thick folder of numbers that she did not yet fully understand and was half afraid of. Adais sat down with her, unhurried, and walked her through it all gently, the way that no single person in all those long years had ever once thought to sit down and do for Adais herself. She was patient. She explained twice where it was needed, and when at last it came time to sign the simple agreement between them, Adais drew out the silver fountain pen from the desk drawer. She signed her name, Adais Whitfield, in the clean and strong and certain hand of a woman who had signed 1,000 contracts in her life, and who would, now, go on to sign 1,000 more, every last one of them, at long last, entirely her own. Then she set the pen down gently on the desk beside the window, there in the pool of warm gold light, where it caught the morning sun and held it, glowing. Somewhere out on the street beyond the wide front glass, a man slowed his hurried step and stopped. He was thinner now than he used to be, and all the old easy polish had worn clean off of him, leaving something smaller underneath. Terrence stood there on the public sidewalk and looked through the window at the warm and ordered life she had gone and built without him. The second life, the one that was hers and hers alone, and had no need of him in it anywhere. Slowly, almost against his own will, He began to raise one hand toward the door handle. But inside, Adaze did not look up, not once, because she was busy, because her nervous young client was speaking and needed her full attention, because the bright life inside that pane of glass simply had no room left anywhere in it for the diminished man standing outside in the cold. After a long, still moment, his raised hand fell back to his side, and he turned, and he walked on down the street, just another gray figure passing by on a road that no longer remembered his name at all. So remember her, the woman in the deep green dress, the one they laughed at and called cheap labor, the one they all so badly wanted to believe was far too quiet and too soft to ever fight back. Remember that the loudest person standing in any room is almost never the strongest one in it, and that dignity, held steady and held quiet, will in the end outlast any cruelty that the world can think to throw against it. The truth, real truth, does not need to scream itself hoarse to finally be heard. It needs only one person patient enough to keep all the receipts, and brave enough when the long-awaited moment finally comes to step forward into the silence and calmly sign her own name to it. She had lost a husband, a brother-in-law, and the comfortable life she thought she had been building. And somehow, she had walked out of all of it with the only thing that had ever truly been hers, herself, intact and unafraid. If this story stirred something awake in you tonight, then carry it gently to someone who needs to hear it, someone waiting on their own quiet morning. And stay a while longer with us, because there are more stories like hers still waiting to be told, and every single one of them ends the very same way, with a quiet person, long underestimated, finally rising.